Hello, Princess. So you are now on the mic. Everyone can hear you and see you on your video. In just a moment there, when you're ready, you can start sharing your slides. Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to introduce Princess Unica Auguste. She is our next presenter, and she'll be talking to us today about a very fun topic. She has a slideshow presentation she'll be sharing with us in just a moment. But her topic is women's rights in the ancient world. For this presentation, we'll have about 40 minutes for the presentation itself, and we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A, which we'll moderate just like the others. So, Princess, when you're ready, begin sharing those slides. We'll confirm that they're full screen, and we'll let you take it away from there.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening. I'm Princess, as Dan said, and my topic is women's rights in the ancient world. And I'm going to talk about a few civilizations in the ancient world that women had rights in their societies or did not have rights in their societies. So we know.
And sorry, Princess, before we continue, you are not sharing your slides right now?
Oh, I thought I was. Okay, let me stop.
So that'll use that button at the bottom there. It says screen share. Should be right between the smiley face and that speaker icon.
Let me go back to. Sorry, I thought they were.
Sorry, we did a quick check backstage. That was just a local presentation, so we do need to restart that for the room.
Okay, I am going to talk about slideshow. Women's rights in the ancient world, and it's a topic dear to my heart, and I'm going to talk about a few civilizations that women did and did not have rights. So we know that the ancient world, for the most part, generally was patriarchic. Women were homemakers and did not have much liberties, or were not able to obtain property or divorce. But as we know, history is complicated. So, and a lot of the time, history was written by men. And there were a few civilizations that women had considerable rights. And so because history is complicated, we have to dig deeper and reclaim those women. I'm going to first start with women's rights in ancient Egypt and Nubia. Now, we know a whole lot about ancient Egypt because the Egyptians basically wrote everything down on their pyramids, on their papyrus, on their temples. We know a great deal about Egypt. We know that women could rule in ancient Egypt, but it was more frequent in ancient Nubia. It seemed that in ancient Nubia there was no problems or no shame or no bones about women being queens in their own right. And while ancient Egypt had female rulers who ruled in their own right, a lot of the queens that we know about did not rule in their own right. We do have a few examples. We have Cleopatra, we have Cleopatra, and Cleopatra is the only one I could come up with right now. But there was another, there were other queens that ruled the owner, but a lot of the other queens, like Nefertiti, like we know about Nefertiti, is because she wasn't a queen in her own right, but she was married to a king, to a pharaoh. In ancient Egypt and Nubia, women could own businesses and property. Women could divorce and remarry, although they preferred not women or men not remarried or divorcing. They prefer that you stay with the same person. Women were entitled to 1/3 of their husband's property. They could serve as witnesses in court cases. which is rare in the ancient world. Not too many civilizations had women that could testify at court. They could be in the company of men. They could also become warriors. I say more so Kush than Egypt because a lot of their queens in ancient Kush seem to have been warriors and led military campaigns. Then, although you have of one or two or three queens in Egypt that led armies, the majority of the queens didn't, as far as we know. Then we have women's rights in the ancient Near East. The ancient Near East, I did Egypt separate because I wanted to do Egypt and Nubia because they're so close by. But the ancient Near East includes places like Egypt, Israel, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, what is now known as Turkey, and Lebanon. Those are the ancient Near East countries. Well, the modern countries who was in the middle. Women were able to participate in civic affairs. They received equal pay. So in the ancient Near East, we know how in the modern world, women's talking about that we are paid less than men. But apparently, women who are living in certain ancient Near East civilizations, countries, territories, received equal pay. They were able to travel freely. A lot of women in the ancient world could not travel freely without their spouse or their father or brother, someone coming with them. Royal women had their own council. Sometimes in certain ancient Near East countries like the Hittites, apparently women and men could marry and they were equals. In many ancient Near Eastern societies, including ancient Israel, the Hittites, ancient Persia, Mesopotamia, women could own property and initiate divorce. But in Babylon and in Assyria, they could not. So a woman in Persia could initiate divorce. A Hittite woman could initiate divorce, but if she traveled to Babylon travel to Babylon or Assyria, she couldn't. If she married someone from these territories, she couldn't initiate divorce and she couldn't control property. We don't talk about women and women's rights, and even we don't talk about Celtic societies much mostly because they don't have a lot of written sources, and most of our sources about the Celts come from the Romans. So one of the things that I have found out in my research about Celtic women in Celtic societies, women could be mediators and judges. Marriage was a partnership. So the man and woman were equal. Women in ancient Celtic societies could not marry against their own will. They actually chose their husbands. They could divorce. They could choose to train as warriors. They could rule. They could take part in business and trade. Those were one of the reasons why the Romans did not per se like the Celtic culture, besides wanting to conquer them, but they felt that their women having high standards or were almost equal in Celtic societies was barbaric. So even though we don't have a lot of written sources, I don't think we have any written sources about ancient Celtic societies. Most of it is the Romans, even though we don't have their own sources, their own voice. This is what you can gather from the Roman sources. Women's rights in ancient Greek society. Now, usually people put Greek and Rome society together, like call it Greco-Roman society. But I decided that we should separate them because apparently, when I continue, the Roman women actually had more rights than Greek women. And some of the rights and liberties they had is surprising because you always think about the Romans as warlike, militaristic, and patriarchal. But women rights in ancient Greek society. The women had virtually no rights in Greece except in cities like Sparta. So we all know that in Sparta, women could own property. Basically, women took part in the same sporting activities, some of the same sporting activities that the men took part. Both women and men could take part in those sporting activities naked. Spartan women could get married at 20, 21, while normal Greek women would get married at 14, 15. They could not initiate divorce. They could not own property in most ancient Greek cities. Marriage was arranged. Women's roles were to bear children, preferably male children. Women had to limit their interaction outside of the home to their nearest female neighbors. So we know that with the previous civilization I spoke about, the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt, women can interact. They could travel freely. They could interact outside of their own neighbors, outside of their own family. They could interact with other people. But in Greek society, most Greek cities did not allow that. Rural women worked in agriculture, which is quite normal for women and children and men, even men in rural areas of these societies, that everybody will work in agriculture. Rights of women in Rome. Earlier, I said that the Romans were militaristic, warlike, patriarchal, but even in Rome, the Romans had given than their Greek counterparts. Free-born women were citizens in Rome. In ancient Greek cities, the only person who was a citizen, were men. Women could be citizens, either foreigners or enslaved people. In theory, when the marriage was arranged in Rome, both parties had to consent. So this is the marriage when two people are getting married, whether their parents are arranging it, the parents have to ask. Parents are supposed to ask the daughter or the son if they want to get married. That's supposed to happen in theory. Roman women kept their family name. So I read something that said that Roman women were always a daughter. Even though they were married, their father still had control. It's still patriarchal, but they still are able to keep their own name. They had a right to own property. They could divorce in Rome, and divorce was informal. A wife just left and took her dowry with her. Although in the age of Augustus, Augustus Caesar and his family values and morality, he kind of
And sorry, this is Dan just popping in a tactical note here. I think we're having some connection issues with Princess. Just a quick poll of the audience. Is anybody still hearing her? Oh, I think she's back now.
Oh, where did
We lost your audio for just about 30 seconds. If you can just go ahead and pick up where you were about a minute ago.
okay. So the women in Rome could divorce, and divorce was informal. A wife just left and took her dowry with her. And that is shocking for Rome, because we know that in the age of Augustus Caesar, he kind of cracked down on immorality. I say immorality in quotations, and he was about family values. But women could divorce in Rome, and they could just leave and go back to their father's house with them, whatever that they brought with the marriage. They engaged in business and trade. So one of the things I found shocking was that women in the Roman Empire, most likely especially the women who were in position, they could basically borrow and lend money. They own land, they own factories. Apparently some Roman women could do calligraphy. So although we have this perception of Rome being macho, militaristic, warlike, conquest, they they had their perks, and even though when Roman women were oppressed, they were not that oppressed compared to Greek women. In classical law, um, domestic abuse wasn't allowed, but even though they had that law, doesn't mean it's going to it's going to be prevented. Stuff happened. Wife beating was grounds for divorce or any other legal action against the husband. I was really shocked about this one when I found out that classical Roman law didn't allow domestic abuse, because of the image that I have and a lot of people have of the Romans being patriarchal and warlike and abusive. So that was a enlightening piece of information for me. So I'm from the Caribbean, Latin America. So I had to put some information about the indigenous people in Mesoamerica, which is Latin America and part of Latin America and the Caribbean. Mesoamerica is Mexico, Belize, Honduras, these Central American countries, which is also included in the Caribbean and Latin America. So in Mesoamerica, women could hold political office. The Mayan women could hold political office and become warriors, but apparently Aztecs and other Mesoamerican indigenous people didn't allow that. But across the board, women had equal legal and economic rights. Women could divorce, women could remarry, they could own houses, land, and other property. Earlier, a while ago, I said women in Mayan society could be warriors, but the Aztecs were more patriarchal and more warlike, and so women could not join the military and take part in warlike activities. But throughout Mesoamerica, women can take part in trade and businesses. We so focus about Greco-Roman society, Near Eastern society, but while these societies were going on the other side of the world, there were other societies that gave women rights or denied women's rights, certain rights. Indian subcontinent. Now I say in subcontinent because before the division of the Indian subcontinent, which is into the countries of Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, all of this was considered, all of these countries were considered the Indian subcontinent. Women were apparently educated. Women were free to choose their own husbands. Women could hold administrative jobs. Women could own property, but it was limited. Limited in the fact that only widows could own property. So if their husband died, women were allowed to have that property. Women also had economic rights. That means they could take part in trade and business. But like most of ancient civilization, the main focus of women in the Indian subcontinent was to be wives and mothers. And lastly, of the ancient civilization is the women of the lands of the north, which is now Norway, Iceland, Denmark, I think Finland too. So we have this perception of the Vikings that women were in the midst of it with the men, but that's not necessarily true. In fact, women in, apparently from my research, women in that neck of the woods had limited rights. In fact, the Romans had more, Roman women had more rights than these women. So most of their rights were in the, basically in the domestic sphere, the home. So one of the rights, one of these things that women could do in Northland was they had full authority of the domestic sphere, especially when their husbands were absent. Women inherited their husband's position on a permanent basis if their husband died. They managed the family finances. They could be artisans. Women could be explorers. However, as you can see, when we look at the other civilization compared to them, because we all have this image of the Vikings being equality. They're not patriarchal, but actually they were more patriarchal than some of the civilizations that we know were patriarchal. For example, like the Romans or the ancient Near East. A lot of their rights were within the domestic, their home, house, farm. They only managed the family's money or 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 assets. They didn't necessarily manage businesses or commerce. How does that connect with video games? I love video games. I mostly love video games that are set in the ancient world. Like I just finished played God of War this morning. So I like God of War. I like Age of Mythologies. I like Assassin's Creed. We already know that although women, there are statistics that say that women are almost half the population of video game players. In the US, I think they're about like 43% of the video game population. In the UK, they're about 44%. And in Australia, they're about 43, around these percentages. And worldwide, they're about 46, 47%. But yet, women are not represented in video games. Even in ancient video games set in the ancient world, they are rare. I like Assassin's Creed, but I don't like how they depict Cleopatra. She's a villain in Assassin's Creed. When you read about the historical Cleopatra, we know that it's more complicated than being a villain. Than I don't necessarily see her as a villain, but in this video game, she is a villain. She's one of the major villains with Julius Caesar. So we have that women are rare in depictions of video games, but yet when we are depicted, we are either depicted as villains, damsels in distress, or stereotypical warriors. In God of War, we have Aphrodite. All Aphrodite can think about is sex. So they sexual, yes, she is the goddess of love, goddess of beauty, goddess of sex, but she's not only about sex. So the video game sexualizes Aphrodite, makes people who probably be interested in finding more about Aphrodite think that that's all what she was about, being goddess of sex. So women are also sexualized. But in the age of mythology, we have the goddess Isis, and she's not sexualized, and she's not a villain. But it seems that's a rare coincidence of a woman being neither a villain, neither a damsel in distress, or a seductress. So the video games, we love to play video games, but they don't want to represent us, or we're not represented. And it's even rare for video games set in the ancient world. So I think that now we're discovering and reclaiming women's rights and women's civil liberties in ancient civilizations. We're knowing more and learning more. I think it's time for the video game creators to put and to pit more women, and it must be very balanced. Conclusion. History is complicated. History is written by the victors. History is written by men most of the times. And so when it comes down to us in this 21st century, we're going to hear that, oh, women should be in the home, or they're not supposed to have interaction with anybody outside their neighbors, and you rarely get any accounts of women in history. The historical records hardly focus on women. So you get historical records about Rome falling, you get historical records about Alexander the Great conquering Greece and Persia. You get stories about wars and famine and executions, but you don't get the stories about the women. And so we have this version of history that women were second-class citizens, but it's complicated. And yes, women were second-class citizens, but and women also in many civilizations had considerable rights and liberties. Thank you. Questions?
I'm going to speak here as a bit of a moderator for these questions and answers. We do already have a question here from Michael on the Q&A. And Michael, if you want to approach the mic, you can do so now. Or if you'd like, I can go ahead and put your question, I can vocalize it for you. Well, oh, there you go.
Sorry.
No worries.
I'm not sure if you saw me in the chat. Yeah, Princess, thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed that. I was just wondering if you have any good books, articles, YouTube channels, anything else that you would recommend for educators who want to teach about women in the ancient world.
I'm sure I could. I would have to put it together and send it to Dan so you can share it together with the other the audience, if that's okay. I could put it together. I don't have anyone on top of my head right now, but I could get it to you and I could put it together and get it to you.
Excellent, thank you. And just a quick producer note on that for any other presenters in the audience. If you do have supplemental materials that want to go out with the recording of your presentation, feel free to just email me at that hitpointscon@gmail.com. And then when I send out the video playlist to attendees, I can include slide notes or links to articles or anything else you want to have supplemental to your presentation. So, Michael, thank you for that question. Any other questions we have from the audience? Feel free to put them in the Q&A, the chat, or approach the microphone.
Sorry.
I did have a question of my own I wanted to add, since I'm the Q&A formally, but you mentioned, I believe, and correct me if I had the title wrong, Age of Mythology, with Isis as one of the goddesses that was depicted there was a good example of presentation of women in video games.
Yes.
Are there?
Sorry.
Go ahead. I was wondering if there's any other examples you want to have, or perhaps maybe if they don't already exist, a suggestion for a type of character you think that has great potential to fit into a video game.
Oh, there is a video game, but it's India. It's based in India. It's called. Hold on. I had it there. It's called Raji, an Ancient Epic, and it's about this girl who loses her brother, and she has to go and rescue him, but she gets help from the goddess Darga, and who believes in her and supports her, but the god Lord Vishnu doesn't he doesn't believe that she can do the quest, and he has his doubts, and she proves him wrong. So I think this is an example of a video game that I think that is a good example. The video game developers doesn't have to follow that example, because there are other goddesses and ancient women in the in the in the world that they could make great video games about. And I don't also like how the video games depict Cleopatra, really. I just don't.
Well, I can say in that regard, you are in very good company. Caragoni, who was presenting yesterday, went into quite a bit of detail on Cleopatra's depiction in the Assassin's Creed video game, so you are not the only critic of that representation. So yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. And just to touch on that one more, are there any other figures from history that haven't been depicted that you think are just ripe for that depiction? Something that maybe is an untapped potential?
Tomyris. She supposedly killed what was his name? The Persian Emperor Cyrus. She supposedly killed Cyrus. There's also Artemisia. She was allied with Xerxes against the war with the Greeks. She was the only woman in Xerxes. I think he was Xerxes. Xerxes held her in high council. There, Amanirenas, the queen of Kush, who led her army against the Romans, and when the Romans decided to call a peace treaty, most of the benefits went to the Kushanites. So there are definitely a lot of women in that video game developers can piggyback on and make them great characters. There's lots of them. And they could even do one with Olympus, Alexander the Great's mother. I think she's a really great character. Great woman. I think she's misunderstood, and she's a lot overshadowed by Alexander and Philip, but she's a great person in her own right.
Excellent. Well, I definitely think there's a lot of potential with all those characters. Please, if you can, feel free to write those down in the chat now, or you can send those to me in an email later on, and we include that as some of those suggestions to go along with your presentation.
Oh, I'm writing them in the chat.
Terrific. And as she is writing those, we have time for just probably about one or two more questions that anybody would like to ask them. Feel free to approach the mic or put them in chat.
But I'll send you an email with the readings with the list of women also. So just in case somebody hasn't gotten them.
Well, thank you very much for that. I was attempting to spell Tomyris. I did not get it right, so I was having some trouble getting some Google search results. So that'll definitely help me out to learn more about that, because there's a lot of great character potential there.
I think I spelled Amanirenas' name wrong, so can't remember it on top of the spelling on top of my head. So
No worries, this is not a final report by any means. You can just give me a copy of that later on, and we'll patch it in.
Yeah.
Well, I don't believe we have any more questions here from the audience, so thank you again, Princess, for an excellent presentation there. I certainly learned a bit myself and have some more reading to do going forward from here, which is always a fun thing to do after a presentation. So with that, you can feel free to exit the stage when you are ready. We're going to end that recording here in just a moment. And just a programming note for all of you, like we've done for the other presenters here. Our next presentation is going to be coming up at 3 p.m. So we're going to have a bit of a break here, similar to that earlier lunch break we had. So please feel free to mingle around the space, try out the maze if you haven't already, play some of those arcade games, or again, take that break if you need it. And our next presentation will start at 3 p.m. Central Time, about 30 minutes from now. We'll have two speakers for this one, actually. It'll be Alexander Vanderwall and Kate Minity, and they'll be talking about ancient worlds and indie video games, an analysis of the Godot Wild Jam number 42, a game jam that happened some time ago that they'll be delighted to tell you all about. So enjoy your break, and we'll see everyone back at 3 p.m. Central Time.